Programming Throwdown, episode 163, Recursion. Take it away, Patrick.
I was trying to come up with a good intro topic for the show, and I decided to harass Jason, so I apologize. No, I'm just teasing. I want to talk about electric cars. So electric cars have always been about to be a thing. I actually am not strongly opinionated about whether they will be this sort of exponential adoption thing that I feel like a lot of tech people feel this is like what will happen. Like it'll just become more and more inconvenient to go to the gas station. There won't be gas stations. And then overnight you'll blink and everyone will have electric cars. I don't know. Not going to get into that per se, but I have noticed a lot more people driving electric cars. So Jason and I were talking about it briefly, but basically, so I drive a plug-in hybrid, which I actually really, really like. I drive a Honda version called a Clarity. I don't even think they make it anymore.
But now, what's the plug-in part mean? What makes it a plug-in hybrid?
So that's great. So Prius, most people know about a Prius, is just like a hybrid. It means that you have a electric motor to drive your wheels, but you have a gas engine to run effectively as a generator to make the electricity. And in something like a Prius, it just sort of does this all the time, but it has batteries. It can short-term kind of store the energy and deliver it. And I might be mistaken. I may have changed over the years about Priuses, but as an abstraction, this will work. So basically, it runs the gas engine and it can store sort of power, but every time you turn your car off and turn it back on, you're sort of more or less starting from scratch. Like it doesn't intend to build up a lot of energy, so it doesn't have big batteries because batteries are pretty expensive. They're also pretty heavy. And so your engine will run from time to time. So there's not really an expected mode of operation where you would go on an entire trip and not use your engine. And so it's sort of more along the spectrum of like even modern cars, when you stop at a stoplight, will just turn off the engine and has like a little bit of, I actually don't know how they did it, but like, a little bit of it can kind of start quickly and get you going without you kind of noticing. So it's just a more extreme version of that, although it predated it. And then
so it kind of reminds me of the Formula One cars. Like the Formula One cars have a battery, and whenever you hit the brakes, it charges the battery. Mm-hmm. And so that builds up. And then when they're ready to pass somebody, they turn on the battery and the motor, and then that makes them super fast.
Yeah, so regenerative braking is this like using the motor that's sort of attached to the spinning part of the wheels to charge up to basically act as a generator, which of course, pulling the energy, there's, conservation of energy kind of thing. Like, charging the battery makes it harder to turn the motor, which makes you slow down. And so you're recapturing some of that energy, which is a really good idea, which is why it's pretty efficient. So the plug-in idea is like most of the original Priuses, you couldn't like plug them into the wall, it wouldn't do anything. There wasn't like a large battery to charge up. Plug-in hybrid sort of is that. It's just sort of like an electric car where you can plug it in and you plug it in to charge it up. And there's a battery that lasts some amount of miles. And in my car, it's something, I forget the range. I think it's like 30 or 40 miles. So most of the commute, like, I just go, up to the grocery store, I go to, the office or whatever, just like briefly. These things are only, for me, like 7-8 miles. So I can go there and back and I don't have to use the gas engine at all. So I have a very small gas tank. It's only like 7 gallons, I think is what it is. Like very, very tiny.
Oh, wow.
And I hardly ever use it. Like I go months and months and never charge it. And when I get home at night, I plug the car in, the plug-in hybrid. But if I'm going to go on a trip, I don't have to worry about finding a charger. So it's on the spectrum of electric cars versus if you go to like a Rivian or a Tesla or something like that, there is no gas engine. So I used to have a Nissan Leaf. It was the same thing. No gas engine, had about 100 miles range. So the range of the battery was further. But if I wanted to go on a road trip, I would have to, stage charging, stops along the way.
Right.
And so it's on this sort of spectrum. But my observations just, I'm actually really excited because I think the diversity in the market, I think, being able to find abundance of choices, not that there's anything particularly wrong with Tesla, but just having more competitors in the market in general, I think is really awesome. And it's exciting to see these electric cars start to come out and start to kind of like make it easier for people who have them to more likely to find a charger somewhere because people are more incentivized to build chargers. Still, sometimes I'll show up somewhere and like charge and people kind of look at you like, oh, that thing gets used? I thought that was just like a reserved spot that, has the charger added at the mall. Like some of the economies around that are a little weird still, but just, it's kind of exciting. And there's lots of debate about where the energy comes from and the ecological, the environmental impacts. There we go. Of making the electric cars versus making gas cars. I'm not trying to get into all that, but just as a like convenience, and I don't have to go to gas stations. There's like less sophisticated moving parts in a fully electric car versus the kind of hybrid it's got more because that's kind of a lot of the traditional stuff and the electric car stuff. But it's kind of nice that in general, not having to go to the gas station, you just kind of forget how inconvenient it is, especially where we happen to live now. For whatever reason, they just haven't like looked at the census data or knows to like build a gas station. So there's like no gas station on any of our like regular occurring routes. So we have to go visit the gas station to get gas, which is
hey kids,
horrible.
We're going to the gas station. So when you say you plug it in, it's a plug-in hybrid. Did you have to get the 220 volt adapter for your house?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So we don't. So we just charge it off of regular thing. Like I know we could do it. We could pay. We price it out. We just chose to do regular because our battery is small enough that we can charge it up overnight. Basically, if you have a 300-mile range fully electric vehicle, it would take you sort of I don't know. I'd have to look probably like 30 hours or something, 20 something hours to charge. So if you drained it all the way down and there's no backup, right? So that would definitely be a call for a quick charge. Versus for me, it's only if I like went somewhere far in the morning and came home. Having 220 would only be useful to like get it back up so I could go again in the afternoon. Versus now, if I do that, I just have to use gas.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is super exciting. If you go on a long trip with a 7-gallon tank, are you refilling very, very often, or how does that work?
So the car basically reverts to being a normal hybrid. So it still gets, I don't know, whatever. The mile per gallon stuff is a little weird. Anyways, it goes to whatever the normal mile per gallon you would get on a hybrid is. So it's still very efficient. It'll still shut off the engine. It'll still, do regenerative braking like you were saying. So I think I get something like 40, 50, 60 miles per gallon.
Oh, that's great.
One. So it's still very efficient. So that's a nice fallback. Not pitching plug-in hybrids. They all have their spots. Just kind of like...
You heard it here first.
No. And I think, like I said, I think Honda stopped making my car. So they don't even make it anymore.
Oh, no.
And where I live, they never sold the car in this state. So... actually, it's like very unique. I've only ever seen one other of this car in the entire time I've been living here because we moved from California. So in California, they sold a lot of them. Here, they don't. So actually, I'm like the only one with that car.
Yeah, I think in California, you can't have a combustion engine car after some time. Like
pretty soon they're going to change it. Yep.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I have another friend who has a fully electric car. I can't remember what it is. Not a Tesla, but it's something else. But it is fully electric, and I think it is a Honda. Does Honda make a fully electric as well, or no?
Is that the Ioniq or something? Maybe yes.
It could be, but
no, that's
he was saying that the nice thing is it's just as you said, you never have to think about the gas station, and plugging it in when you get home is so much more convenient than the gas station. Plus, the gas station causes some like latent anxiety. It's like you watch it, it's like a half full, a fourth full, an eighth full, and then you go in. But that whole time, you have to kind of keep it in your mind. So yeah, I think I have a feeling like the next car we buy, once one of our cars finally kicks the bucket, is going to have some type of battery in it.
Well, your car has a battery in it now, to be fair.
Okay,
yes, I know what you're saying.
Some type of battery-powered engine.
Electric propulsion of some sort.
Yeah, I think the hybrid is, has a lot of nice advantages. So I have a feeling the hybrid is probably... What about the gasoline? Like, if the gasoline sits in the car because you're not using the engine, is that bad? Do you have to, every now and then, just go on the highway or something?
Yeah, I mean, if you probably like over the course of a very, very long time, but I do notice I'm not a car nerd as anyone who is probably already is moaning and fast forwarding, but the gas tank is like, I think it's pressurized or something to help avoid that. So like when you push the gas tank release button, it actually takes like a good 5 seconds before it like makes kind of a special noise and then opens up. So I think they do something to keep it like a more sealed thing to prevent. Which makes sense than, a lot of the issues you might otherwise have, so don't pop up. But I've never had an issue with it. And we do routinely run it, every so often. So we do go fill it up every couple of months. It's not like we go 2 years and never use it. So
Very cool.
All right.
Yeah, interesting. We'll have to see. Well, actually, we'll end it with a prediction.
Here it comes.
At
Yes,
the end
this
of
is it.
this
Let's go.
year, what percent of cars will be either hybrid or electric? Actually, I don't know the percent right now. Here, let me look it up.
This sounds sketchy. No, I'm just gonna say I think it's like you. I think the prediction is like what will and there's no way to like get a metric for it. It's just like what percentage of people will seriously consider like let's say sort of on the spectrum a plug-in hybrid to electric, like something that can drive some tens of miles without using gas. Is that going to be a third of people, a half of people? I think some people, like, you're going to buy a pickup truck because you work construction, you're not probably going to consider very strongly a fully electric car. Maybe that'd be great. But so I like in the next 5 years, what percentage of car purchasers will consider like a fully electric vehicle? I don't know.
Wow, this is nuts. I don't know if this includes hybrids, but it says this is April 3rd of this year. Electric vehicles account for less than 1% of vehicles sold in the US. I feel like that maybe it's just perception bias, but man, it feels like that number is a little low. All right, anyways, so yeah, I guess now that I've seen such a shockingly low number, it's hard for me to have a prediction, so we'll just table that.
You want to just make 1%.
Yeah, my prediction is 2%.
Wow, that's pretty good. That's doubling, more than doubling. That's actually
this is how we do math on Programming Throwdown.
All right.
Time for news. You have the first news. Go for it.
Yeah, I do. So I don't actually have a great article for this. It's just like some running thing that I was observing. I think it's kind of the same person or people. We've talked about code golf in the past. And this interesting spiral. This person was posting a sort of ever declining number of bytes that they've managed to make the game of Snake. Where you like turn left, right, up, down, like, eat the little pixel. I guess it's supposed to be a fruit. Snake don't eat fruit, but like the snake going around and eating and growing slightly longer until you crash into yourself. So someone has been trying to get that assembly version of that lower and lower and lower in number of bytes. They were at the one I have here linked in the show notes. They made it to 101 bytes, pushing for that, getting below triple digit number of bytes to encode the Snake game. But they've been putting it in a QR code. And boy, did this get people very divisive about this. So
really,
yeah. So I am aware of a lot of security kind of concerns, but I'm not overly. I want to say paranoid. That adds a negative stigma to it. But I am not overly cautious about maybe stuff I do. I probably choose convenience more than I ought to. I'll say.
Yeah, same here.
But people were saying, "Oh my gosh, why would you try to tell people to like take a picture of a untrusted, unauthenticated like QR code, especially one that you intend to run? Like, who knows what exploit in it?" And then just like people coming out. Now, to be clear, I don't know what percentage of computer professionals would be represented by the noisy people in the threads, but basically like how it is a terrible idea to ever take a picture of a QR code because it could just be like an exploit waiting to happen, right? Like, it could take you to a payload, it could take you to whatever. Like, you're basically clicking a link, and everybody would say, "Oh, don't click a link emailed to you." But most people would say, "Oh, QR code, what's the worst that can happen?" Now, I don't know how many vectors or how many proven sort of like problems have come through people randomly snapping QR codes like out in the wild, but it is a concern. But I thought it was just sort of one of those like unintended rat holes or whatever, where like you think you're going to read about someone like, clever ways or people collaborating on other, optimizations they could do to get their size lower and lower, or just being happy, or, oh, how cool this is, or references to demo scene, 4K demos or whatever. And those things were there. But then this whole other like brigade of like QR codes are the worst. I was taken aback.
I've seen some video where somebody basically showed how to exploit this, where they were at a restaurant and they stuck a sticker on top of the QR code for the menu that then like sent them to their own site. But yeah, I mean, what you're pointing at is interesting. It's like the serendipity of the internet, where you don't have any social media accounts, Patrick, so I'll have to lecture you on.
To lecture me about it, please.
I had a post on LinkedIn. Basically, this is years ago, but I was just really excited that I got promoted, and I was based on my post. The gist of my post was, I never thought that I would really make it this far. I was really happy, and real thankful, and I thanked like some professors from like a long time ago and stuff, right? And it felt really good to make that post, and that post went viral and got tens of thousands of likes on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And then basically there was a whole ton of comments about how my university is like a crap university. and I it was the thing where like I wasn't mentally equipped to moderate something like that. So I basically just left it. And it turns out LinkedIn is really good at moderation, because I went back months later and all those comments were gone. I don't know how that happened. It wasn't me. I didn't delete them.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's some kind of moderation going on there. But same kind of thing where it's like, yeah, I made this post just to talk about, just celebrate something. And it turned into like this whole like back and forth about like where I went to college. And, that's just the internet. I mean, it makes it like kind of scary to say anything.
Oh dear. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm probably doing the right thing.
YouTube videos and I see the comments and I'm just like, oh, I don't know. I could never be a YouTube creator. I would just have all my comments turned off. Just people upset about the littlest things. There's no like sense of collaboration or like you said, people just move on. Like, why do you need to take pot shots at someone's university? So
yeah, I mean, I think we had comments initially on the blog, and there's a lot of spam, and there was like some divisiveness, and so we just decided to turn it off. And yeah, comments, I mean, that's a whole separate rat hole, but like whether you should have comments or not, I mean, someone should write like a dissertation on that.
Yeah, there's some, I'm not much into the like publicize your podcast, but I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the podcasters on the podcast were talking about another podcast where they were saying the person's thesis is sort of like, you want to be really controversial because like the stuff like you're saying, you should have actually leaned into it and like doubled down on it and like gotten people riled up, because then people will make other posts that link to your post, which will make your post even more important. And like basically you should be like controversially optimizing. So even if you don't really believe it, you should like make a follow-up post saying, where I won't say because you didn't say it, the name of your university is like the best university, because now like right. You have been given a pearl, you have been given a surprise treasure, which you now know that your university is apparently divisive. Therefore, you should double down on it and store more controversy, and this will like propel you to fame and theoretically fortune or success or whatever these people are optimizing for.
Yeah, they call this the attention economy, right? I mean, I was listening to something about I listened to this board game creators podcast, because I think people who make board games for a living are just fascinating. And they were talking about how to do well on Kickstarter, and basically a big part of it is already having an audience. So I mean, one sort of really odd way to get there is to start a bunch of controversy, build up a lot of followers, and then bring them all over to Kickstarter to buy your stuff.
Oh, we should. Okay, I don't want to get onto the Kickstarter thing.
Yeah, that could take forever.
All right, yeah.
All right, my news is superconductor rumors abound. So room temperature superconductors. So I'm sure you've heard about this, Patrick. There's this thing, I think it's LK99 or 77 or something. Okay, 99. It's some kind of, and when I read the instructions of how to make it, it didn't look that weird. I was kind of expecting the instructions to be like, like build a nuclear bunker, hit chemicals with nuclear bombs, or like something crazy like you'd see from CERN or something. But no, it's actually like, here, take these materials, do this stuff. And it seemed like, like relatively straightforward. And so they're claiming that you'd have a room temperature superconductor, which, I think if true, like opens up a ton of different possibilities. I mean, just one, and I'm sure, Patrick, you have even better ones, but just off the top of my head, think about how much power is wasted in getting electricity from the power plant to your house, right? I don't know the number, but it's got to be very high amount of power is wasted. And, if you had room temperature superconductors, you could theoretically bring that to zero, or at least get it a lot closer to zero. And that's just one of, people are saying you could have GPUs that don't get hot and stuff. That I'm not totally sure how that would work, but there's definitely huge application for it. And now everyone's rushing to see And then there was all this controversy around, I guess, the way they announced it. They didn't go through the typical channels, and so people are not sure whether it's real or not, and it's just kind of a crazy situation right now.
Oh man, this is similar to what we were just talking about, opening sort of Pandora's box. Which of the random threads should we pretend to be experts on? So the amount of like people coming out of the woodwork claiming to know things about superconductors, or like what their implications are, or like whatever on sort of, I guess we call it X now, about like
right, on X.
On X. Twitter, the social media network.
Everyone's on X. We have a serious epidemic.
Oh no. But yeah, so I mean, like a couple of things just to like my sort of like thoughts to your thoughts. I've heard a lot of the same stuff. A lot of weirdness around like how this was announced. A lot of debate that I've seen, which is kind of interesting, around like, should we go through the normal peer review process, or is this actually like better, this distributed stuff? People sort of countering, well, this is a big waste, because if this truly is a fake or like a dead end, then like all of this like random people stopping what they're doing, startups putting money into this, and like this race to all become the first to market or whatever is like a waste of resources on a global level. It's much better to have like one or two very focused people sort of proving it out. Other folks saying, well, no, that's the way you just end up with patents, and then it like is protected. Very interesting discourse. I'm not an academic person, so I have no pony in that race. So moving on to the next one, they're like, like your sort of claims like, oh, imagine like wasted power lines. Well, so there's this whole thing of like economics, like even if you took it to zero, the thing still has to be as cheap as copper wire. And even then it has to be ductile.
Good point.
So even if it was a room temperature, or even high, far above room temperature, it might not be very ductile. It may not be able to be put into wires very easily or economically. And then things like you were saying, people were talking about, batteries that never run out in your phone, and like GPUs that don't get hot. And then this descends into, which I was telling people, Landauer's principle and reversible computing, which is this idea like, if you destroy, we have referenced this before, but if you like make a computation, like an AND gate is 1 and 0, 0 and 0, 0 and 1, all have the same output of 0. So information is lost. You had two bits of information, now you have one. And there is a theorem sort of saying that losing that bit of information has a minimal threshold of like wasted energy because of the lost bit of information, which says even if you had superconductors, even if you had new silicon, whatever, GPUs would still get hot. Maybe not as hot. Maybe you don't need a fan, but they're not going to be, it's not like a, zero end game. There is still wasted energy. Your iPhone, your Android phone in your pocket still will consume energy. And so there's like a lot of this, like you're sort of saying, oh, we'll just, put electrons into the superconductor in a big loop, and then we'll have, basically better batteries. So folks are pointing out, actually, superconductors have like this quenching property, which is if the magnetic flux, again, this is not my background, basically exceeds some amount, basically put too much electrons circling around, they build a magnetic field. The magnetic field actually sort of quenches the superconducting ability. The thing that makes the superconducting above a certain magnetic threshold, like causes it to fail. And this is a big concern actually in MRI machines. The Large Hadron Collider had a quench event that apparently, like, the magnetic flux in one of the big magnet coils that are superconducting that they have, that they chill to very low temperatures today, had like a over too high of magnetism, and it basically destroyed the superconductor and caused like a large portion of the Hadron Collider to need to be repaired. So there's like all these like second order phenomena. So people just hear something akin to like perpetual motion or free energy and get like, whoa! It's like, well, hang on. It is a huge market. It is going to open up applications we don't know of today, but it's not like every bit of history is like rewritten because of, a magic material. But still very interesting. I watch it every day. I log on to see like, has someone been able to, there's a lot of weirdness in how it gets made, and no one really knows how to do it. And so is it true? Is it like meaningful? And, can we actually figure out a way to produce it? It may be a decade before like even the first practical applications come out, even if it turns out to be the sort of like holy grail everyone was seeking.
Yeah, here's what I think we need to do, Patrick. I think you and I need to start a petition saying that for the next 6 months, we need to have a moratorium on superconductors, and only we can work on it for the next 6 months. And then we need to petition
I just walked
the
right
government.
into that one. I didn't know where you were going.
we need superconductor safety is
Licensing.
like a primary
The government
concern.
should license.
That's right. Yeah, and everyone except us should be banned from doing work on superconductors.
Are you going to at least tell people what the joke is there?
Yes, that's a reference to the 6-month moratorium on AI that was proposed. I think even Elon Musk signed it. A whole bunch of people who would definitely not stop for 6 months signed it, but they want you to stop for the next 6 months. All right. On that note, Patrick, you want to talk about OpenWorm? What is OpenWorm?
Okay, yeah. Now on to something completely different, but I also don't know about. But I found this is fascinating. So I've seen this for a few years. It came up again recently. They made some progress. So OpenWorm is a project to attempt to create, I think it's, I don't even know what the C stands for, C elegans, some kind of like little flatworm that is composed of a few thousand cells. And they want to make a simulation of the worm. Now, many people have made like simulators of worms before, but they normally kind of go top down. So they sort of start with the behaviors and then they make like a simulator or model that like does those behaviors, right? I mean, we all play video games. This is basically how video games work. Like when you have a video game, enemy that you're chasing around a level, they are not simulating the cells of the organism. They're like taking the behavior and then like applying behavior to a sprite, right? It's kind of more top down. But here they're actually trying to go bottom up. So because this elegans, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, worm is so simple, they have done what they call like the connectome. So the neurons that are the worm's intelligence, they know how each of them are connected to each other. And so here they're trying to model the actual like chemicals flowing between the neurons, the electrical impulses back, and then saying things like, I move this cell is a muscle cell. So if it gets this kind of level of chemical, it's going to shrink in size or grow in size, and that's going to move against the environment, and then that's going to cause pressure on this sensory nerve, which is going to uptick its chemical output, and sort of doing this entirely bottoms up, sort of not at the like atomic level, like there is still, some amount of picking something in the middle, but this much more sort of cellular level, model each cell, and then sort of see if you have the emergent property again of like basically a silicon simulation of the worm that could one day even, find mates and have eggs, and those eggs could grow up in this environment and even,
this is amazing.
Refine their genes and pass on stuff. And you could but right now, computationally, this is like, even for as far as we have for a simple worm like that's actually, I'm going to say cutting edge to kind of do this bottoms up for a few thousand cells. And you can sort of go watch the videos, not in real time, but of the sort of worm wiggling around its environment and trying to make its way. And it's just like a really fascinating, like something at first you'd be like, this is really silly. And then you're like, whoa, I don't even like, it would take me probably a month or more of reading to actually even appreciate what they're actually doing here.
Yeah, this is wild. I'm trying to figure out who actually is behind this.
Oh, like what group?
Yeah, well, it's actually like they have a board of directors. Wow, it's like a ton of folks. It must be some kind of it's a not-for-profit corporation. This is wild. Yeah, folks should definitely check out this video. At first, I thought when I saw OpenWorm, I thought it was going to be like a worm virus, like a computer virus.
I thought the same thing. I was like, someone put source code up for like, computer virus.
Yeah, exactly. This is phenomenal, though. It really looks like a worm the way it moves because they're modeling it at such a low. So, how do they reverse engineer the brain? I guess. I mean that.
So I think this is like it's a well-studied organism. So for like one of the muscle cells, people have isolated it and like observed what stimulus makes it do what output, right? And so they have models for most of the cells. And like I mentioned, people talk about like the genome or like brain scan, but this connectome, which is like neurons are it's a dendrites and the whole thing, right? These neurons are very long and spindly. This is not how neural networks work in the sort of like large language models, but in sort of biology, there's like these very long tendrils, and those tendrils overlap and touch each other. So if you sort of freeze very cold, like the sample, and then you slice it very thinly, and then you apply like computer vision to it. You can figure out this cell touches that cell there, so they can pass chemicals between an emitter and a receptor. And so you can figure out the sort of network of all the cells together. And then they're basically attempting to simulate that. And this is a relatively simple organism, and so it's sort of attainable.
Wow, that is wild. Very cool. Folks should definitely go to the show notes, check out the video. This is pretty awesome. All right, my news. This is a relatively short one, but sad one. The creator of Vim passed away. So he was in his 60s, so he wasn't that old, 62. Bram, I'm probably going to get this wrong, Moulinar. I'm assuming he had some kind of health issue. I don't know if it really said. Oh yeah, here we go. A medical condition that rapidly progressed. It didn't say exactly what it was, but you can actually see on GitHub, he has all this activity, and then right around I think September or October, the activity just stopped. At that point, he must have got some kind of diagnosis or something. I actually, I wouldn't say I've never used Vim. It's been on the computer some time, and I've used it because I didn't have Emacs. I've been more of an Emacs person, but I know Vim's been just incredibly influential on everything. Were you a Vim user, Patrick?
I mean, only by I don't want to say necessity. I've never hardcore developed Vim. I have edited files in Vim, and I know how to sort of get around, but I've never customized it or attempted to use it as my IDE.
Yeah, same here. But it looks like he's from Holland originally. But best wishes to his family, and it's someone who really created something really special for the community. And time for book of the show. Patrick, what's your book of the show?
My book of the show is The Little Book of Common Sense Investing. Definitely a good book. Pretty, I would say easy reading, but more importantly, sort of like what it represents, I guess. Anyways, this is a book by a man named Jack Bogle, who passed away a few years ago. But Jack Bogle, probably most famous for starting the Vanguard group. And so Vanguard Group, which a little United States focused for a minute, but also, has applications to, I think, a lot of financial markets. But basically, his philosophy was, rather than doing sort of trading or picking individual stocks, he sort of espoused the idea of index funds and of diversification and buy and hold. So rather than sort of, there are lots of other philosophies we can talk about in a minute. Anyways, he sort of had this, just keep it simple, have, what you think your, allocation should be, and sort of just invest in it. And this will save you fees. It will prevent you from getting into market timing, which he thought wasn't, a thing worth doing. So yeah, a lot of core principles. I feel like now they've gained a lot more traction than even sort of 15, 20 years ago. This was a little bit more outlandish. People didn't have 401ks that auto invested in target date funds. He was really part of the group that helped make that a sort of thing. And so retirement funds being just in some allocation of equities and stocks. There's a group of people who are very diehard into this sort of way of doing it. They call themselves Bogle heads after Bogle. Anyways, so a deep rabbit hole for sort of investing, but the Little Book of Common Sense Investing comes with a lot of other sort of ways of thinking about money, I would say, in addition to just sort of the investing and savings, but just the importance of that. There is a bunch of rabbit trails to run down here without turning it into a finance podcast about just interest. But I will say, I saw some statistics the other day just talking about how much growth there has been in sort of broad index investing across the world. But in the United States, we have something like the S&P 500 or the Russell 2000, the biggest 500 by market cap companies, and the amount of people investing just in all those 500 rather than not. And they call this sort of passive, where you just buy, and you don't care if it goes up or down. You'll sell when you retire or you need the money, but you're not trading. The amount of passively invested money, there's a lot of interesting debate about, has this changed market dynamics? Is there an end game where markets are somehow messed up because it doesn't matter what your company reports as its earnings? Everybody's going to still buy it because it's part of the S&P 500. There's a lot of debate about what's sort of changing. I won't get into sort of my thoughts there. The efficient market hypothesis. There's a lot of stuff around this. But anyways, a lot of folks listening, early in your career or not, and sort of wondering of a way of thinking about money. You could do a lot worse than picking up this book and sort of thinking about just diversified holdings, not trading, just being really sort of straightforward, not making it overcomplicated. And this is sort of like the vast way of, I think, modeling how I think as well, too, in part because of him and others in a similar vein.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, just a short story. If you don't diversify, if you take huge risk, you could potentially get huge reward, but you could also get completely wiped out. I know if you are going into industry and they're paying you in stock, then you're potentially going to end up with a lot of shares of stock of your company that you already work at. And I've heard stories where people said, "Hey, I've worked at the same company. I was one of the first employees. I've been there for 10 years. The company's doing amazing. And I never sold any of my shares and it just exploded." And that's because they took this huge risk and they got this huge reward. And that's great. You don't necessarily hear the stories of the people who, worked at companies. Company, rose up. The company went public so that they could sell their shares. They held on to everything. And then, inevitably in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, at the next point in time, at some point, the company collapses, and that person loses everything. That does happen more often than as a community we want to admit, and those stories aren't amplified because no one wants to do that. So you really have to be careful. And I'm with Patrick on this. I think reading some material when you're young can help you exponentially in the future.
The compounding growth stuff, I mean, it really, like, now, not that I'm an old person, but I feel old. Not that, but like, looking back and sort of, it doesn't feel like much, a little bit here, a little bit there. But then when you keep doing it year after year, and I think it's actually a philosophy I feel mirrored in how I think about my career growth as well, is just, I'm never looking for so I'll have this, we see this now with large language models coming out, people jumping on like, I'm going to be a prompt engineer, or I'm going to figure out, how to use, this, or we were talking about OK99. I'm going to go figure out how to synthesize your okay, that'd be cool. But that is a way. I'm not saying you can't. It has a more dispersion in sort of your outcomes. You might do really, really well. Often you probably won't. The average case probably not that great. But I feel like in your career, just looking for incremental each year, what's 1, 2, 3 things you can do or learn that add on to what you already have. I feel like this is a way over the course of a career, 10, 20, 30 years, you can be really, really good at stuff by the end if you're just making sort of compounding incremental progress. But maybe that's a broader...
Totally agree. Yeah. Totally agree. Also, just to riff on that a little bit and then we'll move on, but a lot of the times these rags to riches stories are kind of BS. And when you see something small turn into something really big, there actually was a really big concerted effort to make that small thing big. And so, actually a good way, Peter Thiel puts it a pretty good way. He basically says, if you're a big company, you want to not seem like a monopoly because you don't want to get broken up. And if you're a small company, you want to seem really big because you want the investors to get really excited. And so it creates this really weird parabolic effect. And so a lot of small companies actually maybe had a lot of push from the outside, and they weren't actually that small. And so it might give you the impression that in your basement you could start X billion-dollar company, but when you actually dig into the details, a lot of the time there was huge institutional backing even from day one. All right, we'll move to Patrick, I did this for you.
I see this. I'm excited. Let's go.
Yeah, so I decided to read more fiction. My son, basically, the way this happened, my son finished Harry Potter the second time. He read it through it twice. And one of my coworkers suggested Brandon Sanderson because he has a
Who's
book. That? I think it's called Skyward, the one for kids.
Yes.
And so I did that, and I thought, I really should read more fiction. I read all these programming books. I read some economics books, philosophy books. And I just need something lighter, especially I knew I was going to be on an airplane a bunch the past couple of months. And so I got into the Mistborn saga, and it is awesome. I'm a big fan. I remember you talking about this years ago and not wanting to spoil it, but just to recap what Patrick said many years ago, there's people who can manipulate metal in a way that's really magical, and there's all sorts of things that are spun off from that one idea. And I think I've only finished. I'm about halfway through the second book, so I still don't quite understand why. I mean, I'm not spoiling anything here. Why there's ash all over the place. Like, what actually caused the Earth to be destroyed like this? Like, I haven't uncovered any of these secrets yet, but I'm a book and a half in. I'm really excited, and it's something that I've been really enjoying. So it feels good to get back into fiction. I think I'm going to keep it up.
Yeah, and now, like, this is the original trilogy, but then there's also now like additional books that are set after that trilogy. So you actually have a lot of runway ahead of you. And then now that you're in the Brandon Sanderson like thing, you'll find out that the system he's applied here is actually part of a meta system. So like the way that metals sort of work here is similar to how other things, let's just say, work in other locations in the universe of his books. And so there's a treatment of metal in sort of this that is handled by other things in other series. And there are sort of like intertwinings between the series as well. They're not completely isolated. So, just Very to kind of like set the stage, like to dip your toe and then not to get scared, but like, you can keep spiraling further and further out from where you are. But I mean, those first ones, it's some of those nostalgia, like you almost miss going back and like that first kind of like, oh, what? That's just so crazy and it's so cool. Yeah, I remember those are good. They tried to make it into a video game, I think, but I believe it's stalled out. I think it's stalled out. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I thought that was a clever way of saying it. Basically, like, imagine if this whole section of the periodic table was like off limits. It's like kind of like a weird thing to think about, but it's like a good premise behind building a universe. It's really because it's. One thing that I try to shy away from are things that are like futuristic, like Star Wars. And it's not that I have any apathy to that, or not apathy, but it is really apathy. Like when it starts getting into laser beams and spaceships and stuff, doesn't really kind of engage me the same way. But here it was real enough for me that I could kind of see it in my mind's eye. And I might end up getting into the. I know that there's Skyward and all these space ones. I might end up getting into them mostly.
Well, I'm excited. You have to keep us up to date.
Yeah, totally. And I've been jumping into tool of the show. I've been reading this on my Remarkable, which I've been really happy with. Do you have one of these, Patrick?
I do not.
So I've been wanting. I had a composition book full of notes. And I'm constantly flipping among different notes. I had basically a page in this book for each person on my team. I had pages for different topics. And so, if someone would say something that I would need to tell someone else, I would flip to that page in the book. And it just felt kind of silly in today's day and age to be doing that. But the reason I was using a composition book was that the act of writing really helped me remember, not only remember the content, but remember that there is something on that page that I need to take care of. And so it was, and also I could go back through and cross things out, which I know you could do that at Google Doc, but I just found the writing part really, really useful. So I thought I would get one of these kind of note-taking tablets. There's a bunch of options. There's a Books. There's Amazon has a Scribe, which looks pretty good. I settled on the Remarkable because it was recommended by a couple of coworkers. And I think it's great. You can read books on it. You could take notes with it. It has some other features like OCR and stuff, which I haven't really found them that useful. But the core functionality is extremely nice. And I'm usually not one of these people who has any type of fashion sense or any modern gadgets or anything like that. But I will say, when I pulled out the Remarkable on the plane, the people who sat on either side were very impressed. It is kind of like a very large Kindle, but it's extremely well manufactured. It's very thin. The contrast is extremely nice, and yeah, I would highly recommend it.
So e-ink, right? Like it's like you can.
Oh
see
yeah,
it in
we
the
should
sun.
talk about that. So it's e-ink, which means I think the way it works is some electricity is forced in at a certain frequency, and that tells the ink to reveal itself or not, and that happens per pixel. And so that means is like it takes a little while. So like for example, you can scroll, but when you scroll, it's scrolling at like half a frame a second or something, and so it's kind of a weird feeling. It makes much more sense to like flip page to page. But then the nice thing about it is the battery lasts for basically months, and while you're not doing anything, it's not using any energy. And in fact, if you leave it for 30 minutes, it will turn off the Wi-Fi, turn off the processor, basically totally go to sleep and not use any energy, but you still have the whole screen. Like whatever you were looking at 30 minutes ago is still there. It just put a little icon next to it saying it's asleep. So yeah, I mean, I rarely have to think about charging it. And yeah, I read whole books on it and used like 5% of the battery. So yeah, it's a good product. I will say the Amazon Scribe has backlighting. This one doesn't. And so, for an airplane, that's fine because you have the overhead light, but you can't use this at night without having a light next to you.
Now, just imagine if you had a Remarkable and LK99. Just imagine the battery life.
It's like I start using it at 50%, and then I have to turn it off because it overheats.
Warmth from your hand. Yeah. All right. My tool of the show is Stellarium. I think that's how you say it. But just more broadly, there's the class of, I'll say, sort of astronomy apps. I've always had this thing, like I was never big into astronomy. I don't know if you ever were, Jason, but like I had a telescope once, but I was never very good at it. So I've started to get interested in it again. And one of those things I think I downloaded when I first got a smartphone, where you like point your phone up in the night sky and it tells you, what all the stars
I
are.
still use that.
Yeah, not by image recognition, but just by like compass and accelerometers and understanding pose. But they just, I don't know, like I guess I just continued to work on it, and I feel like I used it and it's just like, oh, this is actually really cool. And then also being able to know like when is something I want to show my kids Jupiter or whatever, right? Like, oh, well, when is Jupiter going to be in the sky? And just like it's just very cool. And I was, I'm gonna try. It's been really cloudy here, so I got this idea that I'm gonna do this. I had an old telescope I got out, and then it's been cloudy every night, so it hasn't worked yet. But I have been taking this Stellarium out and like trying to look up and like imagine what the stars would be, and it's just pretty exciting. It's one of those things I kind of forgot existed, even though I guess probably lots of people use it. I think most of these are free. Stellarium and others are free to download. I think they charge you for like additional entries in the star database, or if you want to search for certain things or do predictions about, I guess they're not really predictions, understand when something is going to occur, but in general you can normally use them and poke around them for free, which is pretty cool. So if you've never tried that before, and you have a smartphone, which you probably do if you're listening to this, then I would recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I had my first moment where I felt like my son, who's 10, is like just light years ahead of me in something, and he's really into science, all kinds of science, biology, astronomy. He's constantly reading books on it, and I was pointed to this star that was really bright, and he goes, "Oh yeah," he's looking around the sky, and he's like, "I'm pretty sure it's Venus." And I thought, 10-year-olds, like they're just making stuff up all the time, right? So I pulled out, I don't know if I'm using the same app as you, but I pulled out one of these apps and it was Venus. And like, it totally blew my mind. But yeah, that stuff is super, super fun. It's a great time if you're ever watching fireworks or you're ever in a situation where you're out at night. It's really fun to pull that out and see all the constellations and everything.
Yeah, when it has all the constellations on there, I'm just like, oh yeah, it turns out I don't know anything about any of this. So
Yes.
I would not, if you had pointed out, I'd be like, yeah, star. And then I would have been wrong.
Oh man. All right, on to the topic of recursion, the scariest topic for every first or second year CS student.
No.
I mean, not for me either, but I think that in aggregate, people got more scared about recursion than anything
fair.
else. And I think, we're going to jump around a little bit in the notes, but I think the reason why it was scary is because the way that it was taught, at least at my university, which, as we know from LinkedIn, is a crap university. I actually love my university. I went to UCF, University of Central Florida. I loved it there. It's a great school for CS, but they're kind of being the butt of today's episode. So people were taught sorting, right? And so sorting is kind of like this tool. Like you immediately see how it's useful. Like you could see I have a list of things, and I have a sorted list of things. It makes sense. And then they're taught structures like a linked list and what's another entry level structure? Maybe a binary tree. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, these are structures, and I don't really know how they're useful yet, but it's like I could see the structure and the geometry of it and understand it, right? And then recursion, it's kind of like they're trying to fit that mold to teach recursion, and it never really works. So what will usually happen is they'll say, well, the one I think they use is the making change. So they're like, okay, in the American system, you can greedily make change, where you just give people as many quarters. Like let's say you need 74 cents in change. I just give you quarters until it's less than 25, and then I give you dimes until it's less than 10, and we just keep going, right? But what if there's this crazy, coin system where like there's a 7-cent coin and a 3-cent coin and a 1 cent. If I give you the 7 cent, I can't give you the 3 cent. And yeah, I mean, I guess Patrick's like head is exploding right now.
Well, no, they taught you the knapsack problem as like an introduction to recursion. That's very brutal.
Yeah, and it's like, here's how you make change with, and here's why you can't do it the normal way because you're not in normal currency. And the whole thing was just like, didn't make any sense, right? And it didn't really relate to other stuff. I feel like, I think the reason they do this is if they were to connect it to other things and you didn't grasp those other things, now you're just kind of falling even further behind, right? So if they said, well, here's recursion and how it applies to sorting, but like the kids didn't understand sorting that well, it's like then they kind of totally lose them. But I guess in general, maybe to step back a bit, recursion just wasn't, in general, I feel like isn't taught very well, and that's what makes it so scary to so many people.
I would agree. I wasn't taught that. Like, to be clear, the problem you're introducing is pretty difficult. So we were taught it with, I think you probably encountered it as well, but how to calculate the Fibonacci sequence, which for me was demotivating in a different way, which is it was such an obviously horrible way of computing the Fibonacci sequence. Like it is not that is like not the way as someone who I guess started in like a more optimization C, like low level coding way. As soon as you tell me that you're going to like, I understand what you're talking about with recursion. And then I'm like, no, you do not want to do this. This is not very efficient. And so it bothered me for a different way. I think though, you're right. I think this is it is a natural phenomenon, but not in a sort of like intuitive way you would encounter perhaps before you would be encountering this. So if you've not encountered fractals or self-similarity before, this idea that you have a function and inside that function is an invocation of the function itself. This like self-similarity, the recursive, isn't something you would have been introduced to in math. Although it does exist in math, you would probably not have seen it in the math you would have taken at that time unless you moved to computer science very late in your college career. And so I think approaching this like, hey, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, but like, hey, you're going to just infinitely go down and down and down and down, or forking all your way down. You just start to get this mental model that's very difficult because it's not this sort of iterative, imperative way of programming anymore. In fact, right, like functional programming itself, it bears a lot of semblance to this versus imperative programming. So you think you get a lot of those ties. And then also the failure case, when you mess up your sort of end condition, is your program crashes. And it doesn't crash with like a good error. It crashes like out of memory. which
Yep.
for, if you're in Java and not sort of C or C++, where you've already encountered 1,000 memory leaks, you're probably like, oh my gosh, like what is going on? Like, what does this mean, right? Like
Or like a 10,000 pages of a stack trace or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're not getting useful debugging information when your program crashes. And when you try to print something, like Jason is saying, you just immediately get like, pages and pages of logs until your stack overflows and then you crash. So the like interaction with recursion, at least in most of the languages that I'm familiar with being taught in college, or high school, it's a bad experience.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's it's a really, really, really good point that there isn't a print function which like keeps track of the stack. There isn't a print function that's like, okay, here's this variable, and here's the same variable, in the parent function and the parent of the parent, all the way to the root call of this function. You can't see that all on one line unless you build that into your program, which is not trivial. And so you're right. What you're looking at is, I see all of these prints, and they're all from different invocations. So imagine like the Fibonacci sequence, and maybe I'll take a little bit of time to cover what that is. So I think it's f of x minus 2 plus f of x minus 1, something like that. Yeah, okay. So Fibonacci sequence. So it's a function of x. X has to be an integer, and so it's a discrete function. And f of 0 is 1, f of 1 is 1. So those are your base cases, right? But then f of 2 is going to be f of 0 plus f of 1. So in this case, it's going to be 2. F of 3 is f of 1 plus f of 2, right? F of 1 is 1, and f of 2 we just calculated is 2, so f of 3 is 3. But then you can kind of imagine how this is going to start growing really quickly because you're adding these numbers that they themselves are getting larger and larger. And so it grows in probably some kind of quadratic way or exponential way. And so if you want, for example, f of 100, then that is f of 99 plus f of 98. Now, if you've already computed those in the past, then that's fine. But if not, you have to compute those, which means now you have to call 2 more functions for each of them. And you can see it turns into this binary tree. And all the leaves of this tree are going to be either f of 0 or f of 1. But as you kind of climb up this tree, you're getting larger f values, and you're getting a lot of repetition. You could potentially be calculating f of 4, thousands and thousands of times to get to f of 100. And once you finish, computing this whole tree, then you get your answer. But depending on how you write the recursion, you're kind of going through this tree in kind of different orders that might not be very natural. And so if you think you have some error in your Fibonacci function and you put a print, that print's going to give you all kinds of different numbers from all kinds of different contexts. And it's very hard to debug.
I mean, I'm not a teacher and I'm not an academic, so I've not attempted to teach recursion. Fibonacci sequence, knapsack problem, I don't know. I think maybe we talked about sorting. I think actually attempting to teach something like a binary search or a merge sort, which is not how I first encountered it, but where you have actually like a fixed length list, bounds the problem a bit, right? Where if you screw up your indexes, a simple print statement would sort of tell you you're either repeating an index or you have like your lower bound is flipped with your upper, like some very simple detective work would sort of reveal to you that you've encountered this problem. And I think the exploration of a tree or of all possibilities, which is sort of the knapsack problem and the Fibonacci sequence, feels like mentally more of a large step than this sort of divide and conquer, right? Like I'm splitting something into smaller pieces. And even though I guess it's kind of the same thing, it's a very quantized thing, right? Like I have a list of 8 integers, and then I have 2 lists of 4, and then 4 lists of 2. I'm going to mess it up. I keep doing this. Anyways, and so I feel like this is a more, I don't want to say intuitive. Maybe for some it's not, but I feel like that is the other like piece of teaching the recursive, is using it for sorting and binary search, and without even getting into trees or this just yet. But I feel like that setup maybe sort of the sorting itself, like why a sorted list emerges from merge sort, is a bit harder to grasp maybe. but the sort of like operational bit of it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the reason why they use Fibonacci and knapsack problem is because if you're doing like a tree search, then you don't need any memoization, right? Because you look at something once, and if you got your answer, you're done. And if you didn't, then there's nothing to really remember because you're never coming back. And so they try to teach, recursion, memoization, and the ultimately like the sort of I don't know what you call it, aglometric way of doing recursion all at the same time. So I'll explain what that means. So with Fibonacci numbers, right? We just talked about if you have f of 3, it's f of 1 plus f of 2. But f of 2 is f of 0 plus f of 1. So you see f of 1 is there twice. You need it for f of 2, but then you also need it for f of 3. And so, if f of 1 was really expensive to compute, then you're paying that cost twice, right? So you could do something called memoization. You can say, well, I'm going to start with f of 100. And when I compute f of 98, I'm going to store that somewhere, just in global memory, somewhere on the computer. It's like I computed f of 98, it's whatever it is, a zillion, whatever. And I'm going to store that in a table somewhere. Then when I go to compute f of 99 and it needs f of 98, I just go to my table and fetch it. I don't have to compute f of 98 more than once because I know there's no side effects. Every time I compute this function, every time a 98 comes in, exactly the same number is going to come out. So if I could just store this, then I would only have to, for f of 100, I'd only have to compute 100 things. Because even if I'm calling f of 98 twice, I'm only computing it once. And so that gives you a really nice bound on how much work you're going to need to do. And in the case of Fibonacci sequence, f of 100 could actually take a while on a computer doing it the naive way. But as soon as you do this memoization, it goes from taking seconds or even minutes to like taking, 80 nanoseconds or something, like an insanely short amount of time. Then you can say to yourself, okay, well, I still have to deal with like the whole recursion thing and the call stack and calling, and what happens if I do f of, let's say, 100,000, I need my recursion limit to go at least 100,000 levels deep, even with the memoization, right? And so maybe my computer can't handle that. So what if I was to instead do something a little different? What if I was to say, okay, f of 0 is 0, 1, f of 1 is 1. And I already have those. Those are in my table. Let's say I put those in first. So now what is f of 2? Well, I don't have to do any recursion because I know that anything less than 2 has already been computed. So I just say, well, f of 2 is f of 0 plus f of 1, and not literally calling f in that time, but just pulling those numbers out of my global array and sticking the 2 answer in, right? Same thing when I go to compute 3, I already know that 0, 1, and 2 have already been computed. And so I could just write the answer for 3 and write the answer for 4. And so you don't even need recursion you have recursion in a mathematical sense, but you don't need it in the computer. You just have a for loop from 1 to 100,000 and just write 100,000 answers. That's even better, right? And I'm using the word aglometric, which is just a fancy word for saying, bottom up, but that's the way to do it where you don't even need to have the call stack.
I thought you meant something different. I'm not familiar with that word, but the adjacent thing, I think, to what you're saying in the same realm of like stuff taught here is the sort of duality, not just with the math, but also with saying recursion. What is recursion at like a computer level? That's my background more than maybe the sort of analytical side. And at a computer level, what you're saying is store where you were, all functions are this way. Sort of store where you are on the stack and put information about how you want to invoke the function. So for Fibonacci, you're saying, hey, I want this other Fibonacci, and you give it a number, an index or whatever, right? And you're saying, calculate that. So I need to communicate to the new function of where I'm going, jumping to, that information, but I need to store all of my state. So when you do this in your computer program, all local variables basically need to get put onto the stack so that you can go do this again, right? And that's what Jason is mentioning. If you do 100,000, you get this 100,000 deep stack. Well, that's because of all the extra overhead. The chances of you blowing up your computer resources are a lot higher when you do it that way. But you could also say, hey, there's no difference between using the sort of the data structure stack instead of queue. And so what do I need to know? I just need to know that I want to, in a loop, I want to, either compute where I am or put new things on the stack and then pop things off the stack, right? And so the stack here has a duality. There is an actual data structure stack in your like CPU and RAM that your operating system is maintaining. But we're also saying like the stack is this sort of like concept of, descending down in your recursion. And you end up with this kind of like fluid set of words that kind of describe all of them at the same time, interchangeably. But sometimes you can get around the limit of, an operating system depth of stack by just maintaining a stack yourself and pushing items onto it and popping them off the back. And the evaluation order would be identical to your recursive definition in your program, but you've removed recursion. Well, have you or haven't you? I mean, I guess it's a terminology thing, but this is the other sort of way of thinking about it. And so all of them are roughly equivalent. Like all of them are the same. You are doing the same operation, but it's just sort of operationally how you end up achieving those results.
Yep, that makes sense. And so, yeah, this whole thing where you kind of like reverse the problem, like the Fibonacci example where you want f of 100, but you just start computing from f of 0 and you stop when you hit 100. That way of sort of reversing it, it works for Fibonacci and it works for the knapsack problem, but like the vast majority of problems, it doesn't work that way. Like you can't say,
Tree.
I'm going to search for a number in a binary tree, but I'm going to reverse the problem where I'm going to check all the leaves first. Like it doesn't make sense. But because they want to teach that reversing part, they can't use trees and binary search and these things as examples. And to your point, that forces them to pick these really esoteric examples. And I can tell you from personal experience, like I've done a lot of recursion in different contexts, mostly when dealing with graphs and stuff like that. I have never, ever done the thing where you
reversion,
where you reverse it and you say like, I'm going to go from the base case and build this breadth first thing in the base case. Like, I've never, ever had to do that. Hash tables are so fast now that you can do the recursion with memoization. I've never needed to go hundreds of thousands of levels deep in the stack. So a lot of these are kind of like not real problems. And I think to your point, if they had done, if they teach recursion without that last step, they could open up the aperture a bit. And yeah, kind of with that in mind, we can talk about, what are the times, practically like in our careers where we've used recursion. I talked about, in my case, the biggest one is graphs. There's many times that I've had to deal with graphs. I worked at this company where we had this big social graph that was kind of important. But even more important were all the process graphs. So if you say to yourself, I have this process, it's going to run and it's going to produce an artifact. I have process B that's going to produce another artifact. And I have process C that's waiting on those two artifacts and it's going to produce, a third artifact. So now you can kind of imagine this graph, this acyclic graph where you have all these processes, and whenever, the conditions are met for your process, you can get started. And those conditions form a graph. And you often need to do all sorts of things to that graph to say, how long is this going to take? Or if this part failed, what needs to be regenerated? Anytime you're doing anything with graphs, you're almost certainly using recursion because you want to see, what are all the connections, not just the first hop, but if this process fails, what are all the nodes that can't run? And so it ends up fitting very nicely with recursion. What about you, Patrick? I'm kind of curious. You might have zero recursion or you might have a lot. I really don't know. We're going to find out.
Yeah, so it was the thing I was bringing up. So, I mean, a couple observations is, so one is not too much, but for binary search is a big one. So the sort of naive way. But then as soon as you are like, oh, I'm going to do binary search, I'll do recursion, you're like, bah, bump that, I'm doing it in a loop.
Yeah.
It is the recursive modeling in your mind, but doing it sort of like with index tracking, especially as Jason mentioned, if you only need to go one way, sort of in the Fibonacci sequence, this happens, but in other stuff like binary search as well. Like once you get to your end result, if that's tail recursion, right? Like basically, if you get to your end result and all you're doing is returning up what you found, then to be fair, the recursive part, unlike a sort of I'm computing some metrics on a graph and I need to preserve both, and I need answers from two different paths and some computation and make some decisions. This is more complex. If all you're doing is looking for something in a tree and you're sort of each decision in the tree, you're only sort of having a singular sort of evaluation going on, and then you get to your end and you just pop, 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 pop. These ones become very suitable for moving into loops almost trivially. And in fact, some compilers and in some programming languages, this is sort of like a first-class handled thing to do. So binary search, I've used it a fair amount to do that. And then, like you mentioned as well, sort of exploring graphs. But I would say actually exploring graphs is a model for a variety of things. So lots of things kind of turn into graphs depending on how you sort of do it. So some geometry problems where you sort of have like, imagine a polygon and it has edges around the side. If you're doing traversals, that can end up looking like graph traversals and have a similarity. But even when I'm mentioning you have an array that's sorted and you're doing binary search, even if you're doing recursive, it ends up being a tree, right? You're treating the array as a tree in place. So it also becomes a form of acyclic graph. It may not ever be that way, but it is a duality of the problem. It's just a different representation. And so in that way, kind of the same things you're saying, because I would say almost all problems that get handled this way have a lot of similarity to each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you in some of these languages like C++, is there like a memoization library that you can use, or is there anything? I mean, is it mostly just coding it out of hash tables?
Yes. I mean, this is one of the things I know in Python, you can add a decorator, which I was blown away the first time I saw this to memoize. And I was just like, what? This is crazy. This is voodoo. But no, in C++ it's just, mostly an unordered map and then making some structure for your function arguments and caching them.
The thing about, not to go on too much of a tangent here, but like, imagine if you have a function and all it does is it does some work up front, it calls another function, and then does some work afterwards. You can make that a decorator. So in Python, like a decorator can do just about anything. And so the decorators are extraordinarily powerful. We recently at work, we created a decorator where you do @. I don't remember what they called it, but and what it will do is take the output of your function, and before returning it, will like store it in a database. And so you could do all sorts of really fun stuff with decorators. But under the hood, I think what Python takes advantage of is the fact that everything is hashable. I think with C++, I think with C++, there's like something you have to implement, right? There's like an interface, like an hash override type or something like that.
Yeah, you need to override if you want to insert it into a standard hash table. So it has to be either hashable or you have to provide a way of it being hashed.
Got it. Okay. But I guess just to kind of wrap that part of it up. So, we talked about the Fibonacci example where, you go to compute f of 98 and you see in your table that, the 98th element has something in it. So that means I've already computed that. But what if your recursion is like the arguments are a lot more complicated, right? Like what if it's, a list of people's names that you've already looked at? That is the input to the recursive function. Well, you have to have a way of saying, I've looked at this set of people already. And so what that means is ultimately is hashing. You need to have some type of hash table, some type of one-way hash where you take the input, regardless of how complicated it is, you turn it into a single number, and so then you can go back and look for that item again.
Before we finish our discussion of Fibonacci sequences, to save someone from writing us in, but Fibonacci sequence is like a very common, I don't know why it gets taught in CS. Well, actually, I do. Is this like interesting property where it's associated with phi, where you divide sequential Fibonacci numbers, and it is a closer and closer approximation of this numerical constant phi. So this like is like very entertaining to people, but this is a broader part of the Lucas sequence, LUCAS, which is just all these recursive functions defined this way, and Fibonacci happens to be the one where it's like 2 consecutive and the first 2 numbers are 1. But this is the one that gets talked about, but there's also really other fascinating properties and a lot of the other, I think I'm saying that right, Lucas numbers. I think there's like, if you watch Numberphile YouTube, there's like a Numberphile video about this where they go into, it's sort of one of those, what is it? It's tau versus pi, right? Like tau is superior instead of pi. And anyways, it's like one of those like debates that get raging online.
That's right.
So if someone's here like, they're giving more credit to Fibonacci sequence, here's your shout out to the Lucas sequence.
Yeah, there was somebody at work who was celebrating Tau Day, and it caused me to go down this internet rabbit hole where I don't know if I came out of it any smarter, but I learned a lot about Tau.
So people are like frantically Googling, what are they talking about now?
Yeah, you probably remember this. Like Tau is some type of constant. Like pi is
it's 2 pi. It's just, that's all it is.
Oh,
it's
okay.
It's twice pi, or pi is half tau. However you prefer to like give precedent.
Got it. Yeah, there's oh man, we should definitely do a show. It's a little out of scope here. I'd love to do a show on fractals and the whole like the points on the space where the fractal goes to infinity and where it doesn't go to infinity. I'm totally drawing a blank on what is that thing called? It's like those plots, those fractal plots.
Like a Sierpinski gasket? Like what are you?
No, it's Mandelbrot set. That's what I was thinking of. So yeah, the Mandelbrot set is, imagine if at every point on some grid, you plotted like how long it takes for, if you use that as an input, how long it takes for the output to reach infinity, or whether it reaches infinity or not, something like that. I think it's because that's one thing we didn't really talk about is Fibonacci has a base case, and so eventually it kind of results in some number. But you can imagine if you kind of went the other direction, it would just explode to infinity unless the numbers you're adding are also getting infinitely small. So if you add a half plus a third plus a fourth plus a fifth, the numbers you're adding are getting infinitely small, and so even though you're going to infinity, you're actually approaching a constant. It's kind of a weird thing.
So the Mandelbrot set is you're taking the x and y value of like a Cartesian plane and using them as inputs to complex numbers. And when you multiply complex numbers, sometimes they end up converging and sometimes they don't. And so that's what, like you're multiplying over and over in this sort of recursive relationship, and where it diverges very, very quickly, diverges slowly, converges. And if you plot those out, you end up with a very surprisingly complex shape.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I don't know if this is helping anyone.
Well, we'll do a whole show on fractals. Fractals are really, really fun. We'll give our brain some time to rest from recursion, and then we'll do a fractal show in a few months. So yeah, I think maybe we could kind of walk through how to solve problems with recursion, kind of step-by-step way. So imagine you're in the elite code competition of a lifetime or something, and you have or even you're in your day job and you have to solve a problem with recursion. The first step, I always tell folks, is to write out the base case and make sure it's really comprehensive. So one thing I'll see a lot of problems is where it's like, okay, f of x minus 10 plus f of x minus 1. Let's assume we have that kind of function. If I have that, then, what's my base case for like -6? Like what happens? Like if I call f of 4 and that causes me to call f of -6, like is that is that okay? If I can't have f of negative numbers, now 4 needs to be a base case. Like I need to handle that in some special way. So like make sure that there aren't any holes and that you always end up landing in one of these pockets where you're returning a constant or something that can be easily computed. Once you have the base cases and you've kind of looked at this and said, oh, this is comprehensive, then you build the recursive step. And similar to what I said before, when you're building that step, it's a good time to make sure that you're not, that you're all of your base cases are covering all the ways you can call that. And it's very hard to do this. You have to rely a lot on intuition and just reading the equation carefully. Then I would say, once you have that, then you could optionally add memoization. If you are doing things in a global context, like if you're reading from a file or if you're, checking the internet or something, well, then you can't memoize because maybe you call f of 4 twice, you get two different answers. And if that's by design, now you can't memoize. So ideally, you take whatever that external thing is that's causing your f of 4 to be different, and you make that one of the inputs. So one of your inputs is, the weather today or something like that. So you make it so it's, I think the word is idempotent. You make it so that every time you call the function with these inputs, you get exactly the same output. Then you add memoization, and you should be good to go. As far as testing recursive things, Patrick, you should definitely chat about how you test yours in your context. But in my case, I usually have a way of generating inputs and outputs. So most of the time, if you're doing this, like this example with trying to see how long a job is going to take, you can, for example, the job is a good example. You can say, well, I want this job to take 60 seconds. So I want the answer to be 60. And I'm going to just divide, I'm going to put portions of this number 60 in my graph. So I'm going to have, a chain in this graph that's going to add up to 60. And then I'm going to make a whole bunch of other chains that have like 1 e to the negative 6 time, where I know that they're never going to take as long as that 60. And then I run my unit test and I should get back 60. If I don't, then something has gone horribly wrong. And 9 times out of 10, when I write a test like that, it actually is horribly wrong. So testing recursive stuff is really, really important.
Yeah, testing is important. I would say like I'll riff on it a bit and say, like, for me, especially at least in the beginning, and with it, whatever your language's constructs are for, which is basically adding checks for like what level of depth you're at. So keeping a counter and saying, oh, hey, I'm at level 100 or whatever. Is that something expected or something unexpected? And just adding something that gives yourself a nice helpful print statement or an assertion that says these things shouldn't be ever more than 100 or have more than so many results in your memoization map or whatever, right? And sort of adding some bounds checking, at least initially, just to make sure you don't get into that frustrating loop where, you're computing thousands and thousands of things and it's just breaking and you can't kind of figure out why. So I think that's very helpful. Jason was kind of alluding to it before that it doesn't do it for you, but as you've been developing for a while, coming up with creative ways to visualize the like call graph, either in your debugger, which can still be pretty difficult, but like in your outputs, like having some ASCII pattern or something that tells you what level you're at or how the stuff is nested or adding more spaces to the beginning. I've done various things. I think this can be really useful. So not in the unit testing context so much, but in the like, something has gone wrong. Like, how do I, get it back under control? I think these kinds of things can be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal point. Like in general, if you should write your program such that it never runs forever. Because that is the most painful thing to have to debug. And so, especially if you're giving your program to someone else, like if this is a piece of software that people are going to install in their computer and it just runs forever and, burns their battery or just, keeps their computer from going to sleep. These are all things you should avoid. And so Patrick's exactly right. Every single recursion I've written in practice always has some type of check that says, hey, I've called this function, 10,000 times. That can never happen. I never expect someone to have a workflow of 10,000 units long, and so I'm just going to abort.
I think where we get bit by that sometimes is people will do what they think is like a mathematical thing. So every so often we'll run across some computation that doesn't have a closed form solution. That is, there isn't a direct way of solving it in a finite time. And so you'll use Newton's method to solve it, which is, we didn't talk about this, but this is basically the same. We talk about it iteratively, but it is also somewhat recursively defined. And in fact, often people will define them recursively, and you won't terminate because you'll end up in some state where you're oscillating between two values because of numerical stability and floating point or whatever.
Yep, or you're at a saddle point.
Yeah, and so like making sure that someone is keeping track of, like, we say how long, but often that can be expensive or difficult to do, but just like how many iterations you've gone, and just set some like maximum iteration count that's reasonable. And if it didn't work, either report that there was an error or just say, look, you're close enough, like just deal with it. But yeah, I think like making sure code, like Jason, I do occasionally write while true or forever. It always really scares me because I'm like, this is really, I should just write while, some counter is less than 1,000,000 or something, because it's really scary to write just a loop forever. Even after however many years I've been programming, I still get scared to write like loops that don't like have an auto exit condition, because you'll mess something up and it'll just run forever. And that's like a very frustrating thing for people after you bumping into.
Yeah, I mean, one practical example of this recently was I was writing some code that was interpreting JSON. So I had this JSON object, and the JSON object was recursive. You could have modules that had modules. So you could have objects that have objects, but the recursion was pretty limited. Like you'd never really go more than 3 levels deep. But I had a bug where, I was reading my object, and then instead of reading all the children objects, I read my own object.
Oh no!
That many times for however many children there were, and it just never ended. And the worst thing too was, the way, because it blew up the call stack, it caused like my computer to act all weird, and you get these kind of weird things where your mouse slows down if you start blowing up the memory and everything. So yeah, just yet another data point for putting some type of constraint. Like if you're never going to call this more than 10 times, 10 levels deep, then just add one of your inputs. How deep am I? And if it's 20 or something, that you're in trouble. Cool. All right. Well, that was recursion. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate. Leave comments, reply to us on X, or send us an email, and I'll be happy to continue the discussion over there. But I wanted to give a huge thanks to all of our Patreon patrons, all of our subscribers. Thank you so much for all of your support, and we'll see you all next time.
No, we'll see them in episode 163, Recursion.
That's amazing. See you all later.
See you guys.
Music by Eric Barndollar.
Programming Throwdown is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 2.0 license. You're free to share, copy, distribute, transmit the work, to remix, adapt the work, but you must provide attribution to Patrick and I, and share alike in kind.